So the pathway out and to create change is to become aware, to become conscious in that moment, and to create space to make new choices. And until we're conscious, we're going to be firing from that deeper autopilot self. We're going to be very reactive. We're going to live those habits and patterns no matter how much insight we have otherwise. And that's exactly what I would see week after week, month after month, year after year with my old clients. I worked with incredibly insightful individuals who knew all of the origin of their habits and patterns that weren't serving them. Maybe even during our session time, we troubleshoot. We came up with new game plans. Yet week after week, Bobby, they would come in feeling more and more disempowered, more and more unable to create change because they weren't actually able to build that bridge into creating change. And change comes when we make new choices. And new choices come when we're able to be conscious to what is happening. And again, shifting from that autopilot into that conscious mind to create new actions.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to It's the Bearded Man podcast with your favorite, the world's favorite bearded man, Bob Bay. Special guest on the podcast today. She's trained in clinical psychology at Cornell University at the New School for Social Research. She's also studied at Philadelphia School of Psychoanalysis. Her SelfHealers community has grown to 3 million plus followers on Instagram. You might have come across some of her posts at the.holistic.psychologist. Fresh off the press, she is the author of How to Do the Work, Recognize Your Patterns, Heal from Your Past, and Create Yourself. Today on the podcast, holistic psychologist, Dr. Nicole LePera. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Bobby.
So fired up. Just reading that's baller. You're crushing it.
Thank you.
The doctor aspect, I think, is amazing.
Thank you. A long time. It took a long time to get there. It took a long time to get there.
You definitely had to put in some hours to get to that title.
Yeah, absolutely.
Of course. Now, there's going to be a lot of people that listen to this podcast and they hear holistic psychology. They have no idea what that means. How do you describe that to people that might ask you, like, I don't understand what that is?
Yeah, I appreciate that question too. And I think it comes from the fact that I don't believe psychology has been spoken about in as holistic of a manner for so long. Psychology is a science of the mind. So for very much, it was this idea that we are a mind that is separate from the body. And for me, years into my practice, years into my life as a human who struggled with my own psychological issues, particularly around anxiety, I came to realize how difficult it was to create change. And in seeking to understand why I was struggling in my own life, and again, why my clients were, I really uncovered the need to be a little more comprehensive, to be a little more holistic, and to really honor. So what holistic means for me is the interconnectedness between the body, the mind, and the soul.
I got to be honest with you. So I got about halfway through the book, and thank you for sending it, having your team send it to me. Because I know it's people are trying to get their hands on it and they can't just yet. So I felt very lucky. But the amount of vulnerability of how much you share in this book, I really appreciate and admire. And I think it allows people to feel that they're not alone. And I think that also kind of then goes back to the mind aspect of sometimes we allow these thoughts and we allow moments in our lives to get caught up with us 20 years later, and it's still running crazy in our mind. But I just wanted to say, as we get into this conversation, that I've only got about halfway through the book. I've been trying to crush through as much of it as I could to get up to this podcast, but I also didn't want to just rush through it. I wanted to really take the time and appreciate the book. But your vulnerability and just authenticity of telling your story and the whole truth is really admirable, and I really appreciate that as somebody that's reading it. So thank you for some of that stuff that you have shared, and I'm sure we'll talk about today on the podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. And I appreciate you saying that. For a very long time too, in my field, as the clinician in the room, the expert, if you will, we were actually told to do the complete opposite. Something you might have heard is this idea of blank slate. And I was very much trained like that. Like, don't be a human in the room. Don't share with your clients aspects of your own experience. So I became a person who very intuitively removed myself, not only in my clinical relationships, but I noticed that pattern in my personal relationships as well. So the decision to go online and even begin to share, quote unquote, my story if you will, as I say it, was really an exercise in my own healing journey, because it was quite challenging and is. There's still aspects of the book where, now that I know it's in print and going to however many hundreds of thousands of people will read it, there's a part of me that feels cringeworthy thinking about that.
Yeah. What would be some of the biggest challenges that you have faced in your experience of when you're dealing with clients, right? And I know you've talked about it a little bit in the book of what I've read so far, but like being able to walk in the room and it's business, or not business, but like you're there to help them, but you also have to not connect yourself, and almost when you leave work at the end of the day, not attach yourself, because then you have your own life. So how have you been able to do that, where you're there to help people through your clients, but then at the same time you recognize, I have my own inner work that I need to do too?
Yeah. So I actually think I was quite an expert at doing that, because again, I realized that in my life, I never really was one to acknowledge that I had needs. So that was my second nature, was to put myself aside. So very naturally, when it became my job, and again, when I was instructed to do just that, I feel like I was quite good at it. Slipping out of myself and then really kind of leaving myself out of the room and returning. It didn't feel like it was a difficult thing, though I came to realize that I was so conditioned to do that what I was doing was avoiding my needs, was not acknowledging the moments where I was, at my maybe energetic or my emotional limit. And this obviously applied outside of my job. Yeah. Because I know listeners are probably like, well, that's what you got paid to do. You had clients. Though I saw this in all of my relationships. I became the human who never asked for support, who never said, hey, this is what I'm going through. So again, for me, it was really beginning to break that habit, and in doing so, learning how to factor myself into my relationships was really my biggest hurdle.
Well, the habit thing, that's kind of something I wanted to dive into today. There's the 3 big buckets that I want to dive into today, which pulled right from the book. I want to dive into, the recognizing your patterns aspect, the heal from your past aspect, and create yourself. And I think there's a lot that we can unpack in all of that. But the habits, what's the first step in unlearning a bad habit? Yeah,
is recognizing the fact that we live upwards of, depending on who you read, 95% of our day from our subconscious, from that habit self, if you will. So the very beginning of the book, I talk a lot about the practice of consciousness, of learning how to be witness to ourselves, how to see all of the ways that we're quite habitual as humans, whether it's our just daily habits and patterns in our behaviors, our lifestyle choices, if you will. We're very habitual in the thoughts we think. We tend to spin the same narratives day in and day out about ourselves, others, relationships, the world at large. And of course, they map onto, again, for many of us, very habitual feelings. So the pathway out and to create change is to become aware, to become conscious in that moment, and to create space to make new choices. And until we're conscious, we're going to be firing from that deeper autopilot self. We're going to be very reactive. We're going to live those habits and patterns no matter how much insight we have otherwise. And that's exactly what I would see week after week, month after month, year after year with my old clients. I worked with incredibly insightful individuals who knew all of the origin of their habits and patterns that weren't serving them. Maybe even during our session time, we troubleshoot. We came up with new game plans. Yet week after week, Bobby, they would come in feeling more and more disempowered, more and more unable to create change because they weren't actually able to build that bridge into creating change. And change comes when we make new choices. And new choices come when we're able to be conscious to what is happening. And again, shifting from that autopilot into that conscious mind to create new actions.
Yeah. What I love too in the book is how you talk about it's never really a destination. It always is a work in progress. And so I think the sooner you fall in love with that aspect of it, you stop stressing about, like, I wake up today and I go, I need to lose 10 pounds. And then I lose that 10 pounds, but then I'm still not happy. And then I'm like, well, I need to lose more weight. The sooner you fall in love with the process of they process like there is no destination. It's always going to be a work in progress. I think it makes it so much easier, and you don't get attached to the thoughts in your mind about, beating yourself down and thinking that you're not good enough or, all the things that need to get done to do that inner work. But I really like that aspect of like, it always is a work in progress. It's never going to be just here we are and then it's complete, you know?
Yeah, I'm smiling because I was actually just having this conversation this morning with my partner Lolly, because I'm human like the rest of us, and I think very intuitively we love the idea of an endpoint.
Yeah.
I'm someone who loves to check my boxes and marching toward this idea of doneness. And for me, learning how to embrace the process, the conversation I had this morning was this idea that, 3 weeks from now, once I'm over this book launch, I'll have time to rest and time to find peace. Understanding that 3 weeks from now, I don't know actually what comes. And I think our goal is to cultivate, whether it's peace or wholeness, fullness, whatever it is that we're looking for. How can we empower ourselves to cultivate that in the here and now without searching, like you said, for the doneness, for the external? Sometimes it's time. We think once we get to this day and date, sometimes it's this idea of completion. And we are looking for something outside of ourselves, I think, quite universally.
The other problem we sometimes run into is that we look for these quick fixes, or we think that it's just immediately going to change overnight. How have you kept yourself grounded and present even when you've had times where you're super anxious and you're worried about like all this inner work that I need to do and how much I need to change? How have you been able to not let that get to you and just focus on the small incremental changes?
Yeah. So for me, it's constantly reminding myself to be present. So from what, I'm not sure if you read of my story thus far, I'm someone who was the furthest thing from a conscious being. I was very dissociated, very ungrounded in my physical body and my emotional body. So for me, that foundation of consciousness is still something that I remind myself day in and day out, because I know me as someone who's been plagued with anxiety. One of my favorite places to spend my time and energy is in a future, my attention toward the future, typically worrying about, cataclysmic things that may happen and cause me stress. So for me, I'm still daily reminding myself to be present, because sometimes in presence, we can relieve ourselves from the imagined worry, and sometimes we can't. Being present means sometimes I am anxious, or I am stressed, or I am nervous. And it is in the safety of the present moment that I'm always bringing my attention back and really just trying to ground myself. And that for me, I think can be the most relieving place.
Yeah. I think people will hear this episode and they're going to hear someone like yourself who has had so much experience and who has clearly put in the reps to really know and have done the work. And people will think, I could never get to a flow of that of Nicole, or I could never be that mindful or be that present. But you are the example. You have just continuously worked and honed down the craft of mindfulness, I would say. But I think, outside looking in, we see successful people or we see people that we aspire to be like. And the only thing that's stopping us from getting to that type of lifestyle or that type of success or whatever it might be is just the consistency of working on it every single day. That's all it is, right?
Yeah. And I was that person. I would watch people that had lives that they were living that, appeared to be what I wanted for myself. And instead of looking at that person in a hopeful, through a hopeful lens, like, oh, they can do it, I can do it. I actually did the quite opposite, as I think a lot of us do. I would separate myself out and I would come up with all of the reasons why I was different and I would not have that same result. So for me, like we were speaking before we hit record and I was sharing with you, there is very much, of the beginnings of this that I showed to people, deciding to come online, living in my truth meant also showing how I was creating different aspects of the work that I was doing. Because for me, I want it to be a model for someone out there, showing that you don't have to have the fancy equipment. You don't have to really even know what you're going to do with the platform, yet you can learn how to show up anyway. But I'll be the first to admit, I didn't come by that overnight. I didn't just see someone living a life I wanted and say, oh, great, they can do it, I can do it. Again, I very much argued for my limitations like I think a lot of us do.
Yeah, small little bit of progress every single day. How do you teach somebody to separate themselves from their thoughts?
I think that's the biggest skill that we can teach ourselves to
Yeah.
embody, the tools to create change. And it is a practice.
Yeah.
So when I first met the concept of mindfulness, I was in my early 20s. It was at a time where my anxiety was at a peak. I was living in New York City. I was just starting grad school. My mom was getting a major surgery for her heart. So I had a lot going on, and I had a lot of anxiety around it. And I met this idea of mindfulness, and it was too overwhelming for me to even imagine implementing it. The idea of sitting still, the idea of looking at my thoughts were racing, and were always filled with something, like I said earlier, that was worrying or that was stressful. So the idea of stopping and sitting and viewing and separating myself from my thoughts felt like a hurdle that I couldn't overcome. So I put that idea away, and I actually didn't practice it for a very long time until I, again, began to realize how important it was. So to speak to your point, it's small steps. Many of us do feel overwhelmed by our thinking mind. We can begin to implement the practice of consciousness outside of even a sitting meditation practice. I think many of us think, oh, consciousness or mindfulness, I have to sit in silence. For me, it was learning how to be mindfully or consciously present when I wasn't sitting quietly, because again, my thoughts felt very overwhelming. So for me, around movement in particular, can I take a mindful walk? Can I learn how to do, seemingly annoying, even at times, activities like chores,
washing the dishes
in a mindful way?
Yes.
So the dishes is a prime example that I give. And for me, that was just learning to flex my attention muscle, learning how to create that separation in a way that felt manageable. So then over time, and when I keep saying flex a muscle, I just want listeners to understand that we actually are talking about firing our brain in a new way, laying down new neural pathways. So we're doing some mental gymnastics in a way.
Yeah.
And now very gratefully, we do know that our brain can change up and forever, really, throughout our lifetime. There was a point in our history where we didn't believe that to be true. We thought our brains were set. And now we know that they're not. So however you want to begin to flex that muscle, whether, again, it's through sitting and learning how to be the witnesser or the observer of your thoughts, or beginning to build that small promise, as I say, in action, can give us that little bit of space.
Yeah.
And then once we create that space, we really can open our eyes to the whole world that lives in our minds, that is coloring our daily choices, really.
What percentage of our mind do we actually understand? Like, it still feels like this uncharted territory that we have not been able to crack, even with we're in 2021, the amount of technology we have, and it still is very much a big question mark.
Yeah,
the conscious mind, like,
yes.
it really is kind of like, it gets me freaked out when I think about it, that we don't even really understand how the mind works to a certain extent.
Yeah. And it's for some of it, it's because it's hard to study these concepts of consciousness, these more indescribable, undefinable entities. To a large extent, it's not that we don't understand, it's that most of us aren't firing on all cylinders, if you will. We don't have a mind that's, as we call, coherent. Most of us are living very reactively from very emotional realms in our amygdala and the lower brain regions, and we're not actually functioning from our prefrontal cortex. Every time I say the word consciousness, that's what I'm indicating. That's a different brain region. Most of us aren't living from that conscious mind day in and day out. We're, again, living very emotionally reactive.
Yeah.
And listeners might have heard that referred to even as the lizard brain, because it is literally the same brain structures that we share with amphibians. Yet as humans, we're gifted with this incredible capability in our prefrontal cortex, yet the large majority of us aren't firing from that coherence all day long.
Yeah.
So we're not accessing it, I think, is more the issue.
Yeah. I'm clearly not a psychologist, so take this with a grain of salt. But I've recently talked about that on a solo podcast where instead of reacting to a situation like I'm at a red light and a car hits me from behind and I freak out. I'm like, oh my God, they hit me. I respond to situations where I assess what's happening. I weigh my options, and then I move forward with what needs to get done. And I used to, my blood pressure, any moment in time where like something would throw me off, whether it's anxiety of like a guest coming in and I don't know if I'm ready for it, or, something like that where you get hit by a car. emotions would go through the roof. But now it's like, slow down, assess the situation, then move forward, and don't let these I try to control the emotions as much as I possibly can, which it's crazy to even say that out loud, because a couple of years ago, I if you had said that to me, I'd be like, what do you mean control your emotions? I wouldn't have understood it. But time and trying to really hone in on it, and a lot of meditation and just practicing over the last couple of years, I'm like, wow, I'm in much better control of my emotions than I have ever been before. And feels it's a great feeling when you can kind of get to that space,
Thank you for sharing that. I think that's a really great, beautiful example of what I hope that we are all cultivating, and acknowledging how reactive the large majority of us are living.
Yeah.
How much that those emotions are driving, not only those acute moments where someone hits me and my emotions are through the roof. I go as far to say is our emotions and all of our conditioning, as I call it, all of those neural networks that live in that subconscious, that autopilot that we're talking about, for the most of us, we're living reactively from that space all day long.
All day long.
So very understandably, the word I kept coming up with, that I kept resonating with my own lived experience and with my clients, was disempowered. And that really describes how most of us are living reactive. We don't have control. Once the things happen, it's the dominoes fall. And here I am doing the same things. And for some of us, that's even just our daily habits. We wake up and we're not taking the moment to check in. We're just off to the races, and the day is kind of as it always is.
Yeah.
Creating that space, especially in those acute moments, are again where we gift ourselves with the possibility even of choice.
Yeah.
Of saying, you know what, this time I'm going to self-regulate in a new way, or I'm going to respond in this different way that's going to, again, help me create now a future that's different from those same repetitive patterns I've been living.
Yeah. I think in the book, you talk about that example of like, if the person was like running late in the morning and then, it carries on. Now they're just grumpy to the people they work with. And then it just literally just keeps on going and going. What I've realized is you just have to compartmentalize those moments so that like something emotionally triggers you. And then you got to it's like flipping to the next page, like leave it behind. Don't bring it with you. Don't let it ruin your day. Don't let it ruin that date or whatever you have going on for the rest of your day, and just let it be and then move on. But, easier said than done, but I think it can be learned. It can be learned by anybody,
Yes. And I think the large majority of us are actually, as crazy as this sounds, carrying things that possibly even have happened decades prior. We're so stuck in these repetitive ways of being that so many of us are still reacting in a way to things that might even have happened in our childhood. And not, again, giving ourselves any opportunity to create change in any aspect of our lives.
Oh yeah. I got so many things that are just popping in my head, because it actually segues right into the second part, is the heal from your past. In the book, you talk about your experience of going through your dark night of the soul. What advice do you give to your community or clients that are going through their version of it?
Yeah. So I think honoring the individuality of that, each of our processes, our dark nights of the soul, look different. The way I simply define it is it's, an accumulation of either physical and or psychological symptoms, ways of being that really manifests as a result of being disconnected from our true self, our soul, our essence, whatever the word is that resonates for you, that usness that I believe we all have really deep within. So I think universally, I'm starting to see this word be acknowledged. And I think that's incredibly important, because when we do feel physically those symptoms, or we do, psychologically begin to feel those symptoms of the dark night, a lot of us mislabel them. We think that we're suffering from a diagnosis. We might even think that something is wrong with us. And I think it's really important to normalize it. So that's the first thing is that I would suggest, which is that sometimes our symptoms, or a lot of times, if you ask me, our symptoms are messengers. There's meaning there. If we can pull back, of course, from the discomfort that they're causing and begin to understand. Because when my symptoms really started to happen and to reach, kind of their peak, I similarly began to think something must be physically wrong with me, or something must be really psychologically wrong with me. And like a lot of us, it can be a really shameful place to be. So the first thing that I just want to offer, like I said, is to normalize that. I think it is our individual souls crying out to say that that way of being, however you've been living, isn't working. And the next thing I would then say is that there is so much hope. How you're living isn't who you are. Many of us are living, again, from that conditioned way based on very real accumulation of our experiences, though it isn't our destiny. Again, just a reminder that we can create change, in my opinion, at any age, at any time, as a result of any experience that we have, if we begin to cultivate, again, consciousness as the foundation to begin to then create choice in whatever area isn't working.
Yeah. It's kind of crazy when you think about, and I get it, at a large scale, there's so many people in this world that, for instance, an example, a couple of weeks ago, I was having some acne issues. So I do this teledoc thing, and they're just like, they asked me 3 questions. They're like, perfect, we're subscribing you some medication. And I'm like, scratching my head, like, there's no way I'm going to just go start taking this medication. Like I would have when I was not very woke to understanding that maybe it's what I'm eating, or maybe there's so many other variables, but it kind of scares me knowing that, and I understand it, there's just a massive system because there's so many people. And that's the best way. Like, just let's make this like a factory where you have a problem, here's your medication, move on. Next one, you have a problem, what's the symptoms, move on. But it scares me knowing that people aren't taking the time, not that they're not taking the time to try to understand it, but there isn't a stronger emphasis of like a more holistic question mark of why are these symptoms actually happening? Not, 3 things check off, so this is the medication you need. Let's dive deeper. Let's look like underneath the hood a little bit more and understand what are causing these actual issues versus just giving you a medication and telling you move on and get to the next person,
Yeah. And from obviously a patient or a client standpoint, I get it. When we're uncomfortable, right, we do want to feel better as quickly as possible. So very understandably, I think, grabbing for the medication is relatable. That is the idea.
The quick fix
is going to be the thing that helps me get through this rough patch. And, being a clinician myself, I understand it from the practitioner lens as well, because I know what my schooling taught me. I have an awareness of what medical school more or less looks like. And we're not being taught to look at the root cause. So back to when you asked me to define holistic, I would throw that into my definition as well, which is, an inquiry into what could be causing the symptoms that we're experiencing. Because I believe there is typically an imbalance, again, in one of those areas, an imbalance in our physical bodies, particularly around our nervous system. I talk a lot about our nervous system and how it helps us either self-regulate or not self-regulate. Again, we could also have imbalances in our emotions, not experiencing the whole range of, say, a human emotions and kind of pushing them, repressing all of them, or only cycling through one emotion in particular. And again, spiritually, I find most of us by the time we're adulthood are so disconnected from that essence, are not living in purpose that, needless to say, it's beyond an imbalance. Again, we're just living from a very conditioned, patterned way of being. So when we dive in, we can begin to figure out where our imbalance is, and again, begin to create the new choices in our lifestyle. I talk a lot about lifestyle intervention because I do understand how important that is. For a very long time, we believed our genetics were our destiny, that they determined everything from how physically well or unwell we would be, how psychologically well or unwell we would be. They even, so we thought, determined our personality. And I believe that that is not true, that the choices that we're making each and every day, which become very conditioned, are actually what determines those things.
Yeah. Obviously, I would imagine. So the genetics plays a role, but it's not changeable.
Yes.
It's not, there are choices, like you're saying, you can make on a daily basis that are going to change the course of where you're going. So almost playing the cards you're dealt and playing them to the best of your ability, not think. Yeah, I think that was another book. I think it was the book where you talk about, we're all dealt a certain hand of cards, but it's how you actually play that hand is going to be how, it changes you ultimately. You talk about acknowledging the inner child and the importance of it. if we're happy with where we are today, should we be still acknowledging that inner child, or do we just, we're happy, we're good to go, there's no point in looking in the past is the past, keep moving forward?
I think we carry our inner child with us throughout life. Our inner child is a space that we enter, one might say, as I describe it in the book, where we access creativity or childlike wonder, as I call it. When we're in that very free space connected to us, we're very childlike in many ways. And then, of course, there's the moments where our inner child is present when we're emotionally reactive, where we're operating or activating a deeper wound. So I believe we all have that inner child space with us. Again, I think it's important to become aware of those moments where we're shifted into that younger self, and then to over time, again, cultivate new behaviors, typically around coping, that would better serve our adult self.
Yeah. Podcasts like this, I'm just so much more of a listener, because this is just such a conversation that not a lot of people have or are aware of. Just like you were saying before, they're just kind of just going about their day. They're not even aware or awoke to the decision making they are making on a daily basis, or, the foods they're putting into their body, and they're asking themselves, why is nothing changing when we control that power? So I just think conversations like this are so important for people to listen in on. What's one hurdle you've had to overcome in your past that you're grateful for?
I think every hurdle at this point that I've had to overcome, I've been grateful for. I mean, even shifting the way that I've worked, coming from a very traditional system, training in a very traditional way, all of everything I'm talking about now and talk about on the daily was very challenging for me as a human and as a practitioner. Shedding a lot of those layers of conditioning brought up a lot of grief for me, though, doing so has allowed me to be even more confident in myself now. So I view everything through the lens of difficulty. Here's what this caused me in terms of my discomfort, and also creating space for, okay, given that discomfort, what am I doing about it now? And that's something that I've tried to cultivate. So there's been a lot of hurdles in terms of my child and in terms of my deepest, narratives about myself. And I was asked a question, would I go back in time and shift it and change it? And yeah, while on the one hand, it might have prevented a lot of pain and discomfort, on the other hand, I wouldn't have been able to grow through it to then share my story as I am now. And those hurdles are innumerable. And even, like I said, as much as shifting my life has now allowed me to become the holistic psychologist and have a book and, live in purpose, it wasn't an easy shift as I think some might have imagined it to be. It wasn't. There's a lot of grief that comes along with changing.
Yeah, that's such a beautiful lens to look at your life when you just have nothing but gratitude for the hurdles that have gotten you to where you are today. And then I think it allows you to look at any future hurdle as, when it approaches and it happens, that this is just helping you in some way or shape or form. You don't know how it's going to benefit you today, but that this is going to put you on a path that you didn't expect. And there's a great Steve Jobs quote. I'm not a big person that can quote a lot of quotes, but there's one quote that always comes up to my mind is, you cannot connect the dots looking forward. You can only connect them looking backwards. And so anytime, I think about all the moments that I've had in my own life of hurdles, and how in the moment it was whether it was not getting into the college I wanted to go to, whether it was being heartbroken by this girl, all of those things set me up for future success. In the moment in time, I was an emotional wreck. I thought the world was against me. I was just boo-hoo, just not happy with life. But now looking back at it, I'm so grateful for all these moments, because it just made me a stronger person. It gave me invaluable lesson. I mean, it's just nothing but gratitude for anything that I've had to overcome in my own journey. And I think that perspective is priceless.
Yeah, and that's not to say, though, that we skip over the boo-hoo part. It's just as important to grieve, to feel terrible, to wish it didn't happen, because, I hear a lot about this concept of toxic positivity, this kind of, spiritual bypassing, this idea of just positive think your way through it. And that's an overcompensation in the other direction. So creating space for, this bad thing happened and I can mourn it and feel every way I feel about it and create that space. That word "and" is so powerful. And I think many of us use the word "but" instead. So that's just something I want to offer too, isn't a suggestion to not feel the pain. The pain doesn't go anywhere. We have to feel the pain to release it, to then actually possibly even make the emotional space or the energetic space for that positive reframe.
Yeah, that's a great point and something that I didn't even really think about, because you don't ever want to get into a place where it's like something negative happens in me. It's like, oh, just positive. Like, oh, this is all. It's not like Candyland and everything's just blissful. But I think whatever those emotions are, you have to go through them. But you have to take it along with you and try to find that positive lens from it. But I mean, I don't want to.
Well, your emotions won't let you go too far, because that's the thing. They do. They're an albatross. We store them in our body. We store them in our patterns. They don't actually go anywhere, even though we think we get really good. So like I was describing earlier, I thought I got really good at removing myself, at removing my needs, to the extent that there was a time, a decade or so ago, I would have told you I had no need. In that moment, it wasn't that I had no need. It was only a matter of time before my needs came exploding out in another moment. So we can think we're running from our feelings, though we're not. They're still there. So, relieving that valve and then making the space for a new.
Yeah. They might be hiding, but they can pop
They're
up.
there.
They can pop up at any moment in time. Create yourself. I really like this aspect. How can people gain confidence within themselves to live their most authentic lives? That's something that I'm continuously writing in my journal every single day about. It's like a 5-part journal that I write, and the last part is impact. And within 3 to 5 sentences, it's the same thing every single day. I talk about wanting to help people live, getting to their ultimate inner potential. But then really one line is helping people live their most authentic lives, which I think is so important. How do people do that?
Confidence is a process that we cultivate. Many of us feel disempowered, going back to that word, again, because we're not honoring ourselves, because we're not factoring in, because we're not consciously choosing. I talk about a concept that I call self-betrayal, essentially living disconnected from self in whatever way we do as the conditioned pattern that we do. To build our way back is to cultivate that confidence. And the way we cultivate that confidence, or my suggestion, is a tactic that I call my small daily promise. Really cultivating the alignment between intention and action. Because so many of us have intended to do one thing and done a million different, or again, don't honor our own needs. So we show up in disservice to ourselves. So by showing that alignment between I do what I say each and every day with one small promise, we can cultivate confidence. I share a story in the book about a self-healer who's so near and dear to my heart. Her name is Allie. And she's been on an incredible path, and still is, of transformation, healing from some pretty debilitating symptoms of multiple sclerosis. And her journey began when she met one of my memes where I was talking about self-betrayal, not showing up for self. And as, identifying that very strongly in herself, Allie one day decided to take my suggestion, which was to set a small daily promise to drink 1 glass of water every morning before her coffee. Now, here's where I tell you, doesn't matter what that small promise is, again, because it's the alignment between. So the more days Allie showed up and drank that glass of water, despite all of the thoughts telling her not to, all of the thoughts telling her it was stupid and silly and it wasn't going to do anything, behind the scenes was cultivating confidence, was showing her that, you know what, even if it's a silly small promise, I'm someone who keeps my word. Needless to say, Allie has made many more small daily promises outside of that 1 glass of water. Her MS is completely in remission, and she's quite literally creating the life that she has always wanted to live at this point. So it doesn't matter the promise. I do suggest it be so small that you almost are rolling your eyes at yourself, because something else about, being human that keeps us stuck is that our subconscious, that deeper space that we keep going back to, doesn't actually want to change. We are wired evolutionarily to keep ourselves safe from the uncertainty, the unfamiliarity, the threat that could lurk around that corner. So we actually like, on some very deep level, to live in those familiar ruts. So anytime we go to create change, our subconscious is there waiting to pull us back into that familiar. So making a promise that's very small will help us to walk through the discomfort that's going to be an inherent process or part of changing, though it's the alignment. Keeping the promise is what we're interested in.
Yeah, it's small building blocks.
Small.
Yeah, her story and some of the other ones are very I don't even have a word to say, because it really wakes you up to what some people go through within their own lives. And along with what once again, I'm only halfway through the book, so ladies and gentlemen that are listening, I still got the second half to get through, but just even in the first half, you really you feel like you're part of it. You're part of either your story or some of the stories that you have been sharing, and it's really thoughtful, and it's really it's inspiring at the bare minimum. I'm
really happy to hear that. I think there is a lot of relatability, and that's why I share so often and so frequently my own journey, and also of many of my clients. Anytime we can, and I urge others to begin to share their own stories, because we can see so much and learn so much from other people.
Yeah.
And I think the more that we embrace authentically who we are and our journeys thus far, and of course you don't have to be shouting it to the millions of people like I am, or starting a podcast like you are, right? This could be just the change that we create by just embracing our authenticity in our own small private worlds.
Yeah.
The more we just step into our story and who we are, I believe that really sets us to collectively heal, as I think many of us are looking to do and know that the world needs at this point.
Even if it's just writing on a piece of paper, finding a medium to take out what you're going through. I joke on the solo pods that I do where I tell people it's my therapy session, because I'm just like letting it flow, and then I put publish. I'm like, whoever wants to listen, go check it out. There's my what I have to say about X subject. But just that feeling of getting it off of your shoulders, and it's something that I didn't just wake up one day was a content creator. I didn't just wake up one day was sharing my voice and sharing my story, but I'm so grateful for what it's allowed me to do, where it's like when I have something to say, I say it. I don't hold back. I speak the whole truth. I'm respectable, and I never overstep my boundaries. But when I have something that is really on my mind, I don't even think twice. I grab my phone and I post something about it, and I express it to the world, not because I care about the likes, the comments, or the shareability aspect, but I want people to see the full 360 of whatever I'm going through, and I want people to relate to them, so that hopefully it can give them hope or give them some inspiration. But you have to speak up when something isn't right within you.
Yeah. What a gift to the world that you're offering, Bobby. And I believe that all of us offer when we are true and honest to ourselves. Again, whether or not this translates into just our personal relationships. I, for a very long time, thought that my old way of being, filtering, right, all of everything I wanted to say, do, think, feel through how would this affect someone else. I actually didn't realize I thought I was being a selfless person who was very kind and loving in that. And I came to realize that I wasn't actually being kind and loving to others, because what happens over time as we squash ourselves, we don't actually look in the mirror and say, oh, well, Nicole, you keep squashing yourself. This is on you. We actually look at the people around us and begin to blame them. We become resentful. We look, even going full circle, for the relationship where things will be different, not knowing that unless we're honoring our needs and sharing our thoughts, our feelings, sharing us, no one else has the opportunity to know us. So I believe in a love that is honest, that is kind through honesty, that allows me to be authentic, and that allows me to hold the space for those around me to be authentic, even when it's difficult, especially when it's difficult.
Yeah, I think it's important that, if you're somebody that wants to change the world and you want to help other people, please do that. But you have to recognize how important it is that you have to take care of yourself before you can treat anyone else or take care of anyone else. So it's like, that's the way I always view, where I won't say yes to things until I've checked off every box I need to do, not because I don't value or want to help somebody, but I'm bringing more to the table when everything's checked in. When I get my morning workout, when I get my morning meditation, my journaling, I've had a great breakfast. I've had that alone time where I can kind of get the blood flowing and get myself ready for the day. You don't want to see me before that, So it's like, just trust me. Like, let me focus on me. Let me get myself to my best ability, to my best self. And then I can go and try to help the masses, or I can help in any way possible. But we have to focus so much on ourselves first and then go help others, because if not, there's never time to focus on yourself. And then, like you're saying, it's like at some point you start having resentment for other people, and you have to make the choice. You have to control it, because nobody else is going to, watch over you as much as you are, as you should be for yourself.
Yeah, and as someone who disappointing people is incredibly difficult for me to tolerate, especially my loved ones. So even in the moments now where I could check all of the boxes and care for myself, and there still might be days where, especially now around book launch, my schedule is packed. I'm starting to feel it physically. I'm getting run down. I'm getting tired emotionally after a day of talking with others. I have little left. And yet I go home to a very loving partner who's had a day herself, who might want to share it with me. And there are moments where I have to say, Lolly, like, I don't have the bandwidth right now. I love you. This isn't a matter of me loving you or not loving you enough. In this moment, I don't have the space or the emotions to give. That's very difficult for me to acknowledge, because I hate disappointing, especially the person that I love so dearly. Yet there are even those scenarios where we check all of our own boxes, and there are those days where we just have nothing left to give, yet people might still, quote unquote, need us.
Yeah.
So in those moments, I do believe it is in service of the relationship to have that hard conversation, to say, I'm unable, I don't have the resources right now. Can we check in tomorrow?
Yeah.
And of course, to cultivate the safety in our relationships, to know that it's okay and safe to do that with others.
But just the communication alone of stepping up and making sure that it's like, hey, I've had a long day. I just did a bunch of podcasts. I'm on this big press run. I just need some space. Like, just doing that alone, though, is just such a big step that some people might not even think. They just would push people aside, not respond to the text, or blow people off. And then it becomes just like, well, what did I do? And, so then, but I think just the communication aspect, and then not in that situation with Lolly, but just in general, it's like, if I say no to somebody, like, hey, timing isn't great right now, I got to pass on this because I need to focus on myself. If they come back at me like, well, what do you mean? It's my birthday weekend, blah, blah, blah. Then I'm like, wait a second. Like, if you're blowing this out of proportion, is this really like the friendship and relationship I want to be around? Like, there has to be, there's like almost like at some point you got to draw a line where you need to focus on yourself, but also when you're trying to, participate and be there for others, I don't even know. I'm like losing my train of thought as I'm thinking about it, but there have been specific moments in my life where I've passed on things, and then people come back at me and they're mad that I said no. But then I've had other people where they get it. They go, totally understand. And those tend to be the relationships that last the longest, because it's just part of life. Everyone, you can only say yes so many times. And most times you have to say no to certain things, but I think at the end of the day, it's how you communicate it to people is ultimately what I was.
Communication goes a really long way. And I think even as adults, a lot of us have this magical thinking belief, this idea that people should just know. So I could have just as easily been like, well, Lolly, you should just know. Don't you see that I leave the home and I'm tired? Lolly doesn't actually just know. No one actually just knows until we tell them. And so to speak to, what you're sharing, this idea of boundaries, I talk a lot about limits. And when we place them, when we say, hey, I'm at my limit, friend, partner, family, whomever, the way that person reacts is information. Now, taking in mind, the longer we've been in this relationship, if we've always been there in this one capacity or in this one way, and now say we discover boundaries and we want to start to show up differently, initially, to some extent, we do violate an expectation. Someone might be surprised by our decision to not show up then. Though if it continues to happen consistently, then yes, that is information, right? This might be a person who can't hold space or who chooses not to hold space for us in this way. And then yes, we might choose to modify us and our way of being with that person, modify that relationship moving forward.
Are there any specific boundaries you've created in your life that help you operate at your highest level, especially in a moment in time like this, right? You're on a book launch. I'm sure there's tons of podcasts and press you're doing. Are there, not only during a book launch and something where like all attention's on you right now and you need to be out in public and doing all these appearances, but are there just certain non-negotiable boundaries that you've created in your life that are just super important that help you operate at your highest level?
So boundaries are something that I lacked completely until I began to observe my relationships and create them in my life. So now I think the most frequent boundary, especially around this time and having obligations, is around time and energy. They happen to be still difficult for me, declining podcasts, saying, hey, I'm maxed, my schedule is tight and closed. Even saying no in that capacity is difficult. An even harder boundary that I struggle with in my relationships is holding space for different emotions, having the awareness that I might react to something very differently than those around me, and creating that separation, coming from a family that very much shared the same emotional cycles, typically around stress. For a long time, I connected that sharing, that cycling together as a unit as a version of connection. And what I would notice is I would look around, and if someone wasn't feeling exactly the same way I was about whatever was happening in our lives or in the moment, it would result in me feeling not connected to that person. So something about Lolly is she is quite different than me in a lot of ways. And there are a million moments where she's having a completely different reaction to life than I am. We always happen to end up with those kind of partners, don't we?
Opposites attract, right?
You know what I mean? And so for a long time, and I'm still cultivating that separation, that awareness, that belief, that, idea that, hey, I can have an emotion right now that is different from the emotion you're having. And that's a kind of boundary as well.
Wow. Two separate emotions, but we're here
and honoring them both.
Yeah,
right? Creating the
totally.
space to say, hey, this is causing this reaction in me, and also honoring the space that can acknowledge that it's not, or that when she is having an emotion that's separate from me, allowing her to have that, as opposed to merging as my habit had been.
That's good. Are there any daily self-care or self-love things that you do that help you have like such a positive mindset?
So every day up until this part in my life, and probably for the remainder of it, I'm still doing the work of healing. I'm future self journaling, my daily intentional prompts that I still follow to create consciously my continued direction for change in the future. I'm still doing that. I'm still aware of how conscious I am or how not conscious I am. Being consciously embodied allows me to take those temperature checks, honoring that we're evolving creatures. I don't know how my body's going to feel tomorrow. I don't know how it's going to be when I'm a decade older, nearing 50. I don't know, right? So having those moments of conscious reconnection with myself is something I still do.
And that sets good intention for the day. You feel clear, you feel present, you feel you're in tune with your mind, body, and soul. That just gives you everything you need for that day moving forward.
To begin. And then there's many moments throughout the day where I have to remind myself, hey, check in. I just had 3 appointments. How am I feeling now? How am I doing? Do I need to shift and change my plan? Because I can get very set on what the plan is, and then plow through to follow the plan forgetting that, wait a minute, am I okay? Do I have the resources for the plan? So for me, it has to go beyond what happens in the morning. I have to build in those moments throughout my day to keep connected.
Yeah, always being ready to pivot, make changes as necessary, and not feel that the blueprint that was laid out this is the one and only way to do things. Like maybe the emotion isn't there for today. Maybe I thought I was gonna write more. I'm sure even the process of writing this book, there's probably days where like I'm gonna get through 10 pages, and then you got halfway done, you're like, I'm not doing more than half a page today, you know? So I think it's just constantly just adjusting as you move. The community that you've built, you call them, or they call themselves the SelfHealers, which I love. What's one common trait all these people have in common?
That's an interesting question. One common trait, curiosity.
Ooh.
I would say that something brought them to this body of work that was a bit curious. Something popped on my page, or hit my episode of the podcast, because this is challenging. I think these are new beliefs for many of us. This idea that we can heal, we can change. It's new, and I think that what unifies each of us, regardless of where we are on our journey, is that curiosity. There was something that attracted us to open our mind in this new way. Yeah.
Do you think, and I talked about this with somebody, a podcast a couple months ago, can you teach curiosity?
That's interesting. I think curiosity has to be cultivated. I think curiosity lives in, again, a higher consciousness state. when we're in fear, as a lot of us are living. I talk a lot about trauma in my book, about how our body gets stuck in trauma. Again, the reason why I talk about that, it's because it's a nervous system state of activation that actually does affect our receptivity to the moment, our ability to be curious or self-actualized. I don't know if listeners have heard of Abraham Maslow and his pyramid of needs to be able to evolve into self-actualization. I have my own, and essentially it's honoring our need for body security, being connected to a body whose needs are met, and then our need for emotional security, learning how to have feelings and return to an energetic baseline, essentially get over the feeling, not get stuck in it as we are. And once our needs are met in either of those two areas, then we actually can be fully present and receptive to the moment. And I believe that's where curiosity lives. I believe that's where another word for self-actualization is flow. And all of that, like I said, really does map onto our physiology. So if we are insecure or under threat in body, some of it might not even be mapping onto what's happening in our environment now. Some of us are carrying a trauma body and all of the reactions from childhood. We're not going to be able to actually cultivate curiosity. So I'm someone, a decade ago, if you would have, talked to me about curiosity or all, I had very little of it. I had very little joy. I didn't feel present at all. I didn't really operate in that higher state of consciousness. And it's because my body didn't feel safe. I wasn't actually able to shift into it physiologically.
Yeah. You get into a really sweet spot when you can access that higher consciousness. Yeah. And that's something that I find myself, it always goes back to the journaling, because I journal every day and it's been such a game changer for me. But that's even something that I realized in the gratitude section, where I just write out 3 things I'm grateful for. I'll write, I'm so grateful for the mind that I have, or even just the curiosity that I have, and being just very aware and in tune to my feelings and thoughts. And just that in itself is just such a massive step in your lives, when you can start to be aware, and you can better control the way you're thinking and seeing the world, and changing the lens. Instead of seeing all the negative and, woe's me, you start to see it from more of a positive lens, and you start to, think bigger and get inspired for life and get excited to wake up for the day. And, it's something that I hope that everyone can get to in their lives at some point in time, because, even the days when I was driving Uber full time, as I was telling you before, there were many of days that, I didn't want to go out and drive Uber. I wanted to do this podcast and I wanted to create, but, whether it probably stems back to childhood and, being very fortunate for the parents I was raised by. I did my best to always put a smile on my face and go, I'm just going to give the day my best. And, I've just tried to carry that through. And, I think, it's always been just a work in progress, but, yeah. That's another bearded man story. We talked about Lolly a couple times, and you talk about her a bunch in the book. Sounds like a great woman. Best advice for people searching for love?
Doing the work. I think a lot of us, again, look outside, look for that person who has those traits or can offer us those things, until, again, we become aware of what our needs are and able to recognize them and then offer them up within the relationship. We're going to be seeking part self. We're going to be seeking that fulfillment outside. So again, and I give the same words of advice to parents. When I have very well-intentioned parents asking me, how do I fix my kid? How do I help them? My response is always some version of the same, which is doing the work of healing yourself, modeling. So becoming whole, becoming full allows us to then present more authentically in our relationships with love. Yeah.
And then I would imagine too, you being your most authentic self is ideally going to attract the right person, because you are the person that's attracted to you is seeing the most authentic version of you, versus us trying to portray somebody that we're not, and then attracting people that clearly, it's like magnet. You're pulling in people into your life that's not who you are at heart, which means that it's just not going to work in the long haul.
So I'll offer this here too, just for anyone listening who might not be their authentic selves. And in a relationship, I met Lolly when I was not. this self, when I was not yet on my healing journey, when I was very much operating from my past self. And she is what I call a trauma bond. I talk about it in my book. That attraction to that familiar, type of relationship, yet not being fully authentic. So anyone out there who's listening, you can evolve a relationship. You can create the space to begin to embody a new way of being. Her and I both did that. So, to be clear, you don't have to leave the relationship. We can heal in relationship. We are interpersonal creatures. We need relationships. So when I met her, neither of us were operating from our authentic being, though through our time together and us both dedicating ourselves as individuals and as a couple, we began to evolve as singular humans. And then, of course, the relationship is continuing to still evolve into the future.
Oh, that's awesome. That's great to hear. So it's been like a team effort of
It's been a team effort. And at times I wanted to kill her and she's wanted to kill me. So it hasn't been all rainbows and butterflies, as I'm sure some of you might be imagining. Kumbaya. Absolutely not.
No. That's funny. What's an area of your life you need to put more effort into?
An area of life I need to put more effort into. It's a hard one. I think emotions for me still come up as my top. Learning. I'm still learning. Lolly asked me this morning how I was feeling about the book coming out in 4 days now. And my answer is still some version of, I don't know. I joke, I say I'm a turtle. Emotional processing is slow for me, and so creating this space to live within my emotions and make sense of them. And then furthermore, this is, I think, where I struggle the most. So this is maybe the more accurate answer, sharing my emotions, asking for support, being vulnerable in that way, even with people like Lolly and with whom I'm very close to. So still very much an emotional work in progress.
Yeah. I mean, I can only imagine the work behind the scenes to get the book to the final product and then go, now we got to go sell it. We got to go talk about it. We got to go push it because we've just put so much time, effort, and energy into building it. So, I can only imagine. Last question before we kind of get into the wrap up. Best advice you'd give to people who are striving for their inner potential?
Connection with self, right? Doing the work, being conscious, knowing that it is within. I think maybe that's the first thing I want to state. This idea, purpose, passion. I know those words get thrown around a lot. Again, a decade ago, I would have fought you tooth and nail, Bobby. I didn't have that. There's no purpose in here. There's no passion. I'm a psychologist, and that's intuitively what I was always going to be. But I did not feel like a purposeful human. So word of advice is just acknowledgement that space is within. If you're having problem accessing it or actualizing from it, again, it's being conscious to ourselves and creating that reconnection and, creating then the space to begin to translate that purpose into action, as vulnerable as it might be for some of us. Though just assurance, I think, is what I want to offer here, that it does exist, that we all have a purpose as far as I believe, and that it is a journey, back to finding that purpose.
Yeah. I think when it comes to, and that was the sole intention of the first podcast I was telling you about that I used to run before we got into this, the purpose in the youth, that was the sole intention, is like trying to help people find that purpose. And I feel like the best thing that you can ever do is just throw a bunch of ideas at the wall and see what sticks, and then keep going back to the ones that stick, and some will drop and some will still be sticking, and you have to just keep putting in that effort. But I think it's similar to kind of everything we've dived into today, and even just the big concept of the book of like forever work in progress. I think finding purpose and finding passion is always going to be a work in progress, because what makes us happy today might not make us happy in 5 years from now or 10 years from now. It's not a bad thing. It's just we change as humans. And so just understanding that things are going to change, not thinking it has to be this way or the highway, or it has to be this perfect blueprint, that constant checking in with ourselves every single day is like, does this still make me happy? Am I happy with this person in my life? It's going to guide us to exactly to where we need to be. As we wrap up, I always allow the guest to put a challenge out there to the listeners. If they've made it this far on the podcast, they probably had their notebook filled with notes at this moment in time. This is the most wisdom we've ever shared on the Bearded Man podcast. What's a challenge you have for anyone that's listened to the podcast today?
because we've talked a lot about consciousness, of course, gonna end with
Please.
a challenge, a consciousness challenge. And this is one that I give quite often. I think many of us can be surprised by how unconscious that we are. So my challenge is to, pick maybe two times throughout your waking day to number 1 o'clock and 3 p.m. say, and set an alarm in your phone. And when that alarm goes off in your phone, the first challenge is to ask yourself or notice where your attention is. Are you fully immersed in whatever you're doing in the present moment? And are you in that flow state or receiving any version of the moment? Or are you like most of us, like I know I was somewhere else, lost in the thought about, the argument with your partner that morning, worrying about what's coming up next, or maybe you're just somewhere else entirely. I don't know where I'm at. Second step of the challenge then, of course, if you come to the realization that you're not fully in that conscious mind, in that prefrontal cortex, like we've been talking about, where choice and possibility and curiosity and all that beautifulness lives, purpose and passion and all the things, can we begin to flex that muscle? Can we begin to, I'm always shouting out our breath and the fact that it's ever present. We're always breathing. So can we refocus wherever else our attention was, turn that spotlight, if you will, and I say hook it, right? Hook it on my breath. Pay attention to 1 or 2 deep belly breaths in that moment, bringing yourself back. So I think that is the most beautiful challenge that we can end with, knowing that each and every time you build those conscious check-ins, you're giving yourself a gift with that personal check-in. Well, how am I doing in this moment? Is what I'm doing a match for how I feel? Of course, then giving you the opportunity to make a new choice if the answer is no.
That's beautiful. Now, by the time this podcast comes out, the book will be out. Where's the best way to support the book? Is it buying it through your website, through Amazon? Where should people go to actually buy the book?
So I obviously honor everyone in their individual choices with where to purchase the book. It is probably pretty much at every major retailer. I'm obviously a fan of independent, Black-owned bookshops, things like that. Yeah. So if you can find any of those in your area, I have a partnership here with Malik Books in LA. And I always am sending people that are in this area his way to help support the local, though the book is really available anywhere. And I know sometimes it's location. I have a lot of international followers and I have a lot of international contracts. So you can give a Google and chances are there might even be the book in your own native tongue. So that's a super exciting aspect of this too. And then of course, I'm not sure what those retailers are. So Google can help out on that front.
I'll have the book linked up in the show description to make it easy for anyone else out there. I'm a big Amazon guy. Get you there in 2 days.
And then of course there's Amazon too, but I dare not. I'm not advertising for Amazon.
Okay. I'll have a couple options linked up in the bio, but I just want to say thank you so much for taking the time today. This has been incredible. Just reading through the book. Like I said, I was trying to get as much of it through as I could up to the podcast. It came in last week, so I didn't have much time, but I also was like, I don't want to just rush through this book just so I know every word for the podcast. I got through about half and I was like, this is enough where I want to now finish the book and take my time with it and actually enjoy it. And I have enjoyed every single, everything that I've read so far. But just to echo again, thank you so much for the amount of vulnerability and authenticity that I've read thus far. I think it inspires me to continue to share my voice, to continue to do things like this. And so I really suggest anyone out there that has the funds and is curious to learn more, please check out this book because I think it's really going to open your mind to some really important subject matters that we talked about today.
Well, I appreciate you sharing that, Bobby, because I hearing that makes me feel like I've done my work, because my hope is to continue to empower and inspire others to go out and live in their purpose. So hearing that you are feeling inspired, that is my goal. So thank you for sharing your time and space with me here today.
Absolutely. If you guys and gals enjoyed this podcast, please screenshot this episode, post it to your IG story, tag Nicole, which is at the.holistic.psychologist on IG. Tag me at Bob A, B-O, 3 B's, 4 A's, and a Y, and let us know what you thought about the podcast. It's the best way to grow this podcast, and we greatly, greatly appreciate it. Thank you so much for being on the show today. It was an absolute honor.
Thank you.
That's it for the Bearded Man Podcast. We will see you guys and gals soon enough. See ya!